Donc, avant de commencer, j'aimerais simplement vous rappeler, before we begin, I would like to do some acknowledgement. Donc, j'aimerais faire une reconnaissance territoriale. Donc, j'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que Montréal est situé en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Je reconnais que la nation Makiwawika comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nourrissons aujourd'hui. Euh, et Montréal est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour les nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée, ainsi que d'autres peuples qui y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de la communauté de Montréal. Um, donc, maintenant, pour continuer, j'aimerais introduire ma collègue Joanna Alison, qui est l'analyste des opérations chez CMC, chez Coopérative et Mutuelle Canada. Elle va simplement nous revenir avec quelques-unes des points saillants qui ont ressorti de notre panel sur l'action climatique qui a eu lieu pendant le congrès 2023 de CMC. Ces points saillants vont être un peu un point culminant qui vont nous permettre d'aller par la suite vers le panel d'aujourd'hui. Donc, je laisse céder la parole à Joanna.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today. We wanted to provide a little bit of context of what we spoke about at the panel in June 2023 at CMC's Congress, which we have.
We cannot hear you, Joanna, right now.
I can hear Joanna.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, yes, so we want to present some context from the first conversation we had, which was a panel at the 2023 CMC Congress, where we gathered some of the same participants that are here, some different representatives of some of the same organizations. The cooperators, Solio, were both represented. We also had CCUA as a national association, the Canadian Credit Union Association, as well as La Siembra represented. So it was an interesting conversation, and we mostly dug into frameworks. We walked through where climate action needs to take place in an organization. So we started with looking at where it takes place at a very high level of governance, how to get boards on board. I think that's a fun way to put it. I believe it was Carol summarized that well, and things like dedicating resources within a governance level. So looking at your mission, strategy, vision, and policies, shifting culture and awareness at that level. We brought it down then to operations of governance feeds into operations, and we create a lot of strategies, but how do we operationalize them? So we chatted about how resources can be dedicated and plans can be created, monitored, and evaluated. And then we talked about what the wider enabling environment looked at. And we thought these three areas, governance, operations, and the wider enabling environment, drew together a nice story of the multiple levels at which climate action can take place. There were some stories that were told, some successes, some challenges that were brought out. And when we reflected on that conversation, we wanted to dig into a little bit deeper, and I would pass it to Carol, back to Vero, and then to Carol to begin that discussion a little bit deeper of what's actually going on in organizations that are fully aware of these frameworks and are fully aware of the different levels that it can take place, but are still sometimes experiencing challenges, barriers, and other times huge successes at overcoming those challenges and barriers. So we wanted to dig in and have another conversation to expand on that. And so I'll pass it back to Vero and then to Carol. And thank you for giving a chance to give a little bit of credit to the first panel and all the panelists that were a part of that, because we did really appreciate their contributions.
Thank you so much, Joanna. As mentioned, Joanna, I'm going to introduce you Carol Fraser. They are the moderator of our panel today, and they are part of SSG. SSG was the winner of the Environmental Initiative of the Year. So this was the first time a business won this award. So it's quite exciting to have them moderate our panel today. Carol is an urban planner and a sustainable design specialist with over a decade of experience in equitable economic development, community organizing, organic farming, and food systems. At SSG, Carol is the U.S. Business Development Lead and a consultant working as an analyst and a researcher on decarbonization pathways and climate action plans for municipalities and regional governments across the United States. So they are also more they also have more than a decade of experience as a staff member and a board member of democratically managed community organization and worker cooperative in Canada and the US. This includes working with Ferme Coopérative Tournesol outside of Montreal and acting as president of the board of the Austin Cooperative Business Association. As a multilingual and a binational planner and community organizer, Carol has a unique perspective having worked with cooperative and sustainability organization in both Canada and the US, and they bring this experience to their everyday work on climate action. So please a warm welcome for Carol. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique and Joanna. I'm so happy to be here today moderating this panel. I'm really excited to hear more from our panelists in just a moment. But thank you, Joanna, for the overview of the previous conversations that we are continuing here today. I'm going to provide a really brief overview of climate action and the need for climate action given the climate crisis before we dive into our questions for the panelists. So as was mentioned, I work with Sustainability Solutions Group. We're a Canadian-based worker cooperative working with cities and governments across the Americas on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating more equitable, decarbonized communities for all. We're really driven by the climate crisis and the need to act now. We know that based on the current science, that in order for the Earth, the planet, to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, global greenhouse gas emissions need to decline really dramatically, 50% by 2030 in just the next 7 years. And of course, reach net zero by 2050. So we recognize not only in our work that, of course, cities have a major role and governments have a major role to play in reaching those targets, but also the cooperative sector has a potentially very transformative role in terms of how we get there and how the actions that we take are actually implemented. So we see that there's a few steps that cooperatives can take on their own and in cooperation with other cooperatives to actually eat this elephant, so to speak, and make sure that we're on track to reach these goals. So the first step being taking stock of cooperatives' GHG emissions, everything from the buildings and facilities and fleet vehicles that each organization operates to the electricity and the energy used to heat and cool buildings, as well as what's referred to as scope 3, the things that we purchase, our travel, our investments. All of those things have emissions, and understanding that picture is really helpful for the following steps, which are to set a science-based target to how each cooperative is going to reduce its emissions in line with that Paris Agreement, with that 1.5 degree of warming framework. There are a variety of ways of doing that, but creating a plan to reduce that carbon budget going forward is really key. Looking at different scenarios for how those emissions can be reduced over time, looking at the different set of actions and then prioritizing them, having that conversation within each cooperative is really key. There are different things that will have more or less impact on reducing emissions over time. And then finally, probably the most important thing is monitoring and evaluating those actions over time, coming up with key performance indicators, frameworks for engaging your board and your staff over time to make sure that those things are on track. So we work with governments, as I said, and also with other cooperatives on developing plans that reflect these steps. And what we're going to hear from today from the panelists are how each of their cooperatives and the cooperatives that they represent are taking these steps, what the challenges have been along the way, what other cooperatives can learn on their journeys, whether you're just starting out or whether you're further along, and then what kind of the next steps could be to address these challenges, not only us individually in our cooperatives, but as a movement could be. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to each panelist to introduce themselves very briefly. We'll hear just the name, their cooperative that they're affiliated with and their role there, the nature of the cooperative, what kind of operations do you all do, and then very briefly, how the climate crisis is affecting what you do in your cooperative. And then we'll dive into some questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So I'll pass it over to Alison Coates from Vancity to start us off.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that, Carol, and that great introduction and really setting the scene there. I'm Alison. My pronouns are she and her, and I am with Vancity, which is a credit union located here in Vancouver, British Columbia, on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw people. Vancity has over 560,000 members, and we serve those members through 54 branches spread primarily in the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, and Alert Bay. I lead the climate strategy and performance team, which is charged with developing and overseeing Vancity's response to the climate crisis. And in terms of how we see the climate crisis affecting what we do, I would say that really it impacts all aspects of what we do, both in terms of the risk that climate change poses to our organization and our members, but also in terms of the transition that we need to go through in order to hopefully end up in a low carbon economy that limits global warming, as Carol was touching on there. And so it really impacts us in terms of what we lend to, who we lend to, how our members are doing, and the health of the communities that we operate in. And our response to that, therefore, needs to be a really holistic approach towards taking action. And I'll touch more on that as we dive into the panel.
Thank you, Alison. Tom Ewart with Cooperators.
Great, thanks a lot, Carol. Hello, fellow cooperators. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Et merci mille fois de m'avoir invité et accueilli ici parmi ce groupe extraordinaire. My name is Tom Ewart, and I'm the AVP of Sustainability at Cooperators. As Carol said, we're a financial services cooperative, pronounced he, him, and speaking to you from the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations of the Anishinaabe people. So just a few quick remarks in reaction to the question of how cooperatives is affected by the climate crisis. I think it's safe to say that as cooperatives, all of our organizations are purpose-driven. So that may lead you then to wonder, well, Tom, what is Cooperators' purpose, and how does that relate to climate change? Because that should inform our climate action and therefore everything that I have to share with you today. Cooperators' purpose is financial security for Canadians and our communities. Now, just take a moment to reflect on the relationship between that purpose and climate change. Climate change poses a very clear and significant risk to our ability to live our raison d'etre. And it poses that risk today, especially in the current macroeconomic climate in which we find ourselves, with many affordability challenges from housing on down. And looking to the future, it's going to continue to increase until the day that we achieve net zero emissions, when the threat will finally cease getting worse, but it'll still remain a threat for decades, even if we significantly increase our resilience. So I hope that makes clear why we care so much about this conversation, what's at stake, why we're here today, why you may hear some passion in my voice at times, and why I need to be very careful to limit how long I talk for so that I take up only my fair share of time, because I could go on for hours on this topic. Back to you, Carol.
Thank you so much, Tom. Next, I'll introduce Irfan Hasham.
Thanks, Carol. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope everyone can hear me. Awesome. To start, my name is Irfan Hasham. I'm a regional energy coach for CHF Canada. What my role involves is helping co-ops look at sustainability and energy efficiency from a more holistic approach. I think for the longest time, the sector has kind of avoided looking at this because there was a set of different priorities, and I'm here to kind of help out with our 900 or so co-op members in finding strategies, finding funding, finding opportunities really, and looking at it from a technical perspective at a co-op by co-op level. So I work directly with the co-ops and try to put all the pieces together for them. I am a professional engineer, and I have been in the energy management industry for about a decade now. So I think that helps quite a bit with regards to finding opportunities that would directly affect these co-ops. With regards to how our organization is affected by the climate crisis, obviously our members are directly affected by this climate crisis. And I think at the same time, we do have an opportunity to combat climate change. So looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to introduce myself.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Noémie Varin-Lachapelle.
Bonjour tout le monde, moi je vais m'adresser à vous en français aujourd'hui. Moi je suis localisée à Montréal. Donc je suis directrice de l'environnement et des mesures d'urgence chez Solio Groupe Coopératif, et la mission de mon équipe est de s'assurer d'une saine gestion des risques et de la résilience par la promotion des meilleures pratiques environnementales et en mesures d'urgence en adéquation avec nos politiques déjà en place, pour s'assurer en fait du déploiement de projets puis de l'amélioration de la performance environnementale et de mesures d'urgence au sein de la grande famille de chez Solio. Nous, l'organisation, on travaille déjà avec le vivant, hein, donc les changements climatiques nous impactent déjà directement et indirectement et continueront de le faire dans le futur. Je ne sais pas s'il y en a qui sont familiers avec Solio Groupe Coopératif, mais c'est une entreprise qui a eu 100 ans en 2022. C'est la plus importante coopérative agricole canadienne, la 24e plus grande coopérative agricole au monde. Donc, c'est les producteurs agricoles qui sont à la base de notre raison d'être. Ils sont plus de 123 000 regroupés au sein de 47 coopératives. L'organisation grand complet engage plus de 16 000 employés, puis son chiffre d'affaires s'élève à plus de 8,9 milliards. Évidemment, puisque c'est une coopérative, lorsque les dettes sont payées, les surplus sont retournés dans les coopératives aux producteurs agricoles à titre de ristourne. Et puis, Solio Group est propriétaire de Solio Agriculture, qui est la division agricole, qui est déjà impactée par les changements climatiques. Aussi, Olimel, qui est le chef de file de la production puis de la transformation et la distribution des viandes de porc et de volaille. Finalement, Groupe BMR, qui est le premier joueur québécois en importance dans le domaine de la quincaillerie. Donc, au plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui, et je suis très heureuse de pouvoir discuter de ce sujet fascinant qui est l'adaptation au changement climatique et la lutte, bien entendu. C'est tout pour moi.
Merci, Noémie. Thanks, Noémie. So, yeah, we'll dive right in. Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. As you heard, we have a great diversity of cooperatives and cooperative sectors and types represented here today. So let's start by exploring the variety of challenges that arise when each cooperative with their various sectors and industries wants to take climate action. I'm going to turn to Alison first off. Can you tell us about what have been the challenges for Vancity in terms of taking climate action as a credit union and as a financial institution? And how is Vancity beginning to address its own operational emissions as well as those of its members and its investments?
Sure, thanks, Carol. And really looking forward to hearing from everyone on the panel today. Some great introductions there. Looking forward to diving in. In terms of your question, Carol, so financial institutions are interesting when it comes to understanding, quantifying, and actioning on climate impacts. So we have operational emissions, so the emissions associated with our day-to-day operations that Carol touched on earlier, the natural gas that we use in buildings for heating, any emissions associated with our electricity use, business travel, goods and services that we purchase. And Vancity's been acting on those emissions for quite a long time, so quantifying those for a number of years, driving reductions and offsetting remaining emissions. But where our significant emissions lie, as Carol alluded to earlier, is what's called Scope 3 emissions. And then specifically within Scope 3 emissions, something that's called our financed emissions. So these are the emissions of the things that we finance, like homes, businesses, and commercial buildings where we're lending or making investments. And that's really been a huge thrust of our work over the past 5 years or so. So we've been working to calculate the emissions of all of these things that we lend to, that we invest in. So buildings, businesses, projects, understand their reduction pathways, and then progress our commitments towards net zero lending and net zero investments. And to do that, we need to deliver initiatives that achieve reductions. That's a pretty big undertaking, and we've run into lots of challenges as we progress this work along the way. So I'd say the first one that I'd highlight is really building knowledge within the organization. I think we had a pretty good handle on what it was meant by operational emissions and what we were trying to do there, but financed emissions is a much newer concept in the industry. It's still an evolving piece of work in terms of how those emissions are quantified and acted upon. So we had to do a lot of building in the organization, understand what those are, why we're calculating them, how we're doing it, and how we can actually drive reductions. And that relates to another challenge that I would highlight, which is the ability to actually make reductions to these emissions. So the emissions of things that we finance are things that we have a lower level of control over versus our own emissions. So we have to work through our members in order to achieve reductions. So businesses and buildings we finance, those are not our own. And then I would highlight, and I think other credit unions and smaller financial institutions and other co-ops might run into this, is our portfolio mix. So Vancity does not lend to or invest in oil and gas, and we're not really lending in any significant volume to other what are sort of noted as high emitting sectors. So cement, steel production, aviation, etc. So there's no straightforward space to say, well, we're not going to do X anymore. Our big sources of finance emissions are buildings we finance, businesses we lend to. Mostly those are small and medium-sized enterprises. And we do need to continue to lend to those members so they can purchase a home, so they can build their business. And that means that we then need to work with our member to drive reductions. And we're working often one-on-one, individual members, individual member businesses. Or, we don't have a couple large corporates that could take action and make a really big dent in our finance emissions. And then lastly, I would say a challenge is the scale of the work. So quantifying these emissions is a big piece of work, and it only is growing. The approach is constantly evolving, and for portions of our book, there's actually still no methodologies for even how we would calculate and quantify those emissions. So we know there's a lot more work ahead of us. At the same time that we're doing that, we're still trying to drive down our own operational emissions and evolve our approach in that space. So I would say, there's always more to do. So I know I've highlighted a lot of challenges there, but I would say it hasn't stopped us from making progress. We uncover more as we go along, but there are always spaces to work, and it's actually like, I love it because it's problem solving all day, all the time, and that can be really fun.
Thank you, Alison. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I think one thing I'm taking away just right off the bat, what you highlighted around, you are a actor in terms of what you fund as an organization, as an institution, but there is a level of partnership and, as you mentioned, working with a lot of small other actors to make a big systems change. I think that may be an emergent theme challenge today, but maybe also an opportunity. I'm going to pass it over to Noémie for a similar question. So can you tell us what have been the challenges for Solio and its divisions and its members in terms of taking climate action? I think you are muted.
Yeah, sorry. Merci, Carol. Comme vous avez pu le constater là, plus tôt dans la description de l'entreprise, la structure organisationnelle de Solio Group est très complexe et comporte énormément de ramifications, autant compte tenu de son empreinte sur le territoire que du nombre d'installations, les co-entreprises, les coopératives membres et les membres qui ont un son propriétaire. Fait que c'est très, très politique comme organisation. Les opérations des 3 divisions sont très différentes, tout en étant complémentaires pour alimenter la chaîne de valeur, ce qui entraîne des enjeux différents quant aux actions à prendre pour lutter contre les changements climatiques. Dès le début de la démarche de responsabilité sociale d'entreprise de Solio Group là, en 2019, il a fallu s'assurer d'inclure des indicateurs GRI communs concernant l'adaptation au changement climatique afin que ceux-ci soient mis de l'avant dans les démarches des 3 divisions, donc Alumel, BMR et Solio Agriculture. Ça a représenté un énorme défi, autant au niveau de la concertation des parties prenantes internes, afin qu'elles se mobilisent et qu'elles adhèrent aux mêmes objectifs que ceux de la fédération. Donc, on voulait assurer une cohérence entre la fédération, les divisions, puis ensuite les coopératives. Puis ça, c'est vraiment venu là, de la haute direction et du conseil d'administration qui ont été très fermes là, sur le fait d'inciter et de favoriser la cohérence. Et puis, le concept de développement durable est maintenant inscrit au cœur même de la mission de l'organisation, qui est de contribuer à nourrir les gens en veillant à la prospérité des familles agricoles pour assurer un monde, un avenir durable. Donc, ça, c'est une grande réussite, mais qui est venue d'un défi à la base. Puis un autre défi aussi, c'est que l'agriculture, c'est souvent vu comme une des causes des changements climatiques. Toutefois, l'agriculture est définitivement une solution aussi pour lutter contre les changements climatiques, notamment par l'adoption de pratiques de conservation des sols, l'implantation de cultures de couverture. Il y a plein de choses qui peuvent être faites là, pour que, en fait, les sols deviennent un puits de captation du carbone. Il a donc fallu mobiliser nos parties prenantes internes et externes dans ce sens-là, ce qui a permis aussi de mettre de l'avant et de promouvoir des actions qui étaient déjà effectuées par Solio, de par son ADN coopérative et de son réseau, mais aussi de prendre action pour démarrer d'autres projets à valeur ajoutée qui permettent de lutter et de s'adapter au changement climatique. Parmi ceux-ci, il y a des exemples concrets de projets là, qui permettent de lutter contre les changements climatiques. Il y a la nouvelle orientation de la ferme de recherche en production végétale de Solio Agriculture qui est maintenant axée sur la pratique durable et l'agriculture biologique. Ça a été un changement de cap là, 180 degrés pour délaisser l'agriculture industrielle puis se tourner vers une ferme de recherche à vocation d'agriculture durable. C'est pas encore toutes nos parties prenantes internes n'ont même pas encore tout adopté ce nouveau langage-là, mais c'est en cours. On utilise aussi maintenant des nouvelles technologies numériques là, comme Ag Connexion pour s'assurer des 4B, en fait. Là. Donc, l'application des produits de fertilisation puis de protection des cultures au bon moment, à la bonne place, au bon endroit, en bonne quantité, aussi quand c'est vraiment nécessaire. On accompagne aussi les producteurs bovins dans l'adoption de pâturage intensif pour limiter aussi les dégagements de GES. Et on a procédé au cours de la dernière année de la construction d'une nouvelle usine d'enrobage de fertilisants à Saint-Thomas en Ontario. C'est la première usine de ce genre-là au Canada. C'est une technologie qui vient d'un consortium avec les États-Unis, en Alabama plus précisément. Puis maintenant, ces engrais enrobés sont à libération contrôlée, puis contribuent à soutenir nos producteurs dans l'effort de la gestion de l'eau, de l'air et des sols. En fait, ces engrais-là, ils livrent plus d'éléments nutritifs aux cultures, tout en réduisant les pertes de nutriments dans l'environnement et aussi, le moins de dégagement, le moins d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Donc, ça aussi, ça a été toutes des nouvelles technologies puis des nouveaux projets qui ont été mis de l'avant dans une perspective de lutte au changement climatique.
Thank you, Noémie. So yeah, also kind of a compliment to Alison's overview of the credit union and financial sector. With Solio, you have a direct impact on emissions, and it sounds like some of the challenges have been aligning the many different members and divisions within your larger cooperative, and also creating transformative practices, changing the way you do business day to day, not only setting a target, but actually having a new factory, as you mentioned, or different, more sustainable agricultural practices. So overcoming, maybe people have different words for talking about it and kind of getting aligned. So thank you for sharing that. So for the last panelists on this particular question, let's turn to Irfan. Can you tell us what have been some of the challenges for CHF and its members in terms of taking climate action?
Sure, and I'll start with our members and kind of just a bit of background information. So if you look at the affordable housing sector, approximately 75% or so was built before 1989. So it's an aging stock when you think about affordable housing. So I think it's important when looking at sustainability, it's kind of hard for co-ops to balance the nice to have items and the, safety or anything that's required. And I think a lot of times, you'll look at a building condition assessment and, a building condition assessment assesses like for like replacements. And I think, the mindset needs to change a little bit here with regards to how these assessments are taking place and kind of understanding what actually needs to take place from the root of the potential issue. And I think that is looking at the energy efficient piece as well. So I think, even with the aging stock, projects become more complex, but then at the same time, there are definitely ways to reduce your carbon footprint and look for low-hanging fruit. But on that as well, I think education and awareness is very important. I think the sector needs to be, educated a little more on what sustainability is, what energy efficiency is, and what that means to each specific co-op. And I think that's where it all starts. With regards to some of the more larger challenges, I think resources and capacity constraints in the context of the housing crisis and limited resources and staff is a big piece here. A lot of times I speak to co-ops, I have kickoff meetings, but then I notice that I'll have to be involved quite a bit, and it's quite tough for me considering the fact that I'm a regional energy coach for all the co-ops that CHF or all the co-ops across Canada essentially, and there's only one of me, and there's thousands or quite a few co-ops out there, so I can't champion a project on my own necessarily, and I think that has to be considered internally at the co-op board level or within the co-op itself. And then last but not least, I think with regards to understanding the different supports that are available to the affordable housing sector, there are quite a bit of incentives available and whatnot. And, I'm sure a lot of you folks have seen, CMHC launched the Canada, the CEGA program. I'm trying to remember the acronym here, Canada Greener Affordable Housing Program. There we go. I know that the targets are quite hard to reach, but at the same time, these programs are launching. I just think from a program perspective, at times, affordable housing gets missed. It falls into like a weird category where, it doesn't fit into your commercial buildings programs that are available, whether it's at the federal level or at the provincial level. And it doesn't fall into multi-res or housing. So co-ops sometimes fall into that category where it's kind of tough. But if you look deep enough, and you'll find quite a few programs available out there. The FCM has a sustainable affordable housing program. So there are quite a few things that are considered barriers. But if you look well enough and do your research, you will find opportunities for your co-op to be able to reduce the climate footprint.
Thanks so much for that overview. Yeah, it sounds like, with housing cooperatives in particular, since you're operating a specific building in a particular place with residents, that localized view and focus is so key. And having the resources to do it is really key to, as you say, when you're looking at improvements or changes to the operations, making sure that they are not just meeting the requirements, but thinking about the climate crisis and how to address it, reduce energy use and emissions, et cetera. So now we'll turn it over to Joanna and talk a little bit more about how, we've heard from some of the cooperatives here that they have strategies or different ways to, have a plan for addressing the climate crisis, and these are underway. But can we talk a little bit, Joanna, about how cooperatives that might be developing a plan, ensure that strategy is not put on a shelf, but rather it's operationalized and it can lead to concrete changes in practices?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I draw some of the information from the great contributions from the panel we had before this, where we dug into some of those questions and then expand on it with, well, what's next? And there's still some barriers to operationalizing when we have some steps already in place for knowing how to turn strategies into operations. And one of the first reflections that I think is really important is to not create, it's before operationalizing, it happens still at that governance level of not creating the strategies in a silo. Because most organizations have a pretty clear strategic plan that already exists. And it can be very exciting to create new strategies for each new initiative that we want to take on. But as mentioned already, there are various resource and capacity constraints within multiple sizes of organizations, from large to small. And so creating strategies that are considering your strategic plan from the get-go, they really help with the next piece of integrating and operationalizing. So I think that's one of the big takeaways of when there are resource constraints and you're trying to operationalize something, trying to find the multiple touch points that already exist in your organization where this can feed into. So there was various really great suggestions for how to operationalize these types of initiatives. I think in this panel itself, we see dedicated staff, folks that are inside organizations that are really focused and honed in on the issue, sharing with the rest of the staff and the board updates. Some organizations don't have the capacity to do so. So there's other opportunities that are suggested, such as providing trainings and workshops for the staff that are working in different departments to understand how does this feed in departmentally. Creating little focus groups within organizations where folks are meeting perhaps monthly or bi-monthly or in some regular consistency, so that if you can't have a dedicated person in the organization to pay attention to these issues, there's a team or a couple of people who are pushing forth the momentum with the capacity that you have, keeping up to date with these types of conversations, and seeing how it fits into a strategic plan or the other departments. So I think in this call itself, we have represented a lot of larger organizations and larger cooperatives, but we do look to how would a small cooperative or a startup in a way, really look to operationalizing this. We talked at lengths about how we can't just have a plan and be doing activities without monitoring and evaluating and creating some sort of internal KPIs. And again, I think that feeds back into relating it to the existing strategic plan that is likely already being monitored and evaluated. And so instead of creating an entirely new framework, trying to feed into the existing frameworks in an organization, one of the big takeaways, I think, when I look at the experience of a national association, we represent all types of cooperatives, both cooperatives that are directly involved with direct emissions, cooperatives that are taking more of an association or federation role and are supporting members like us. And we reflect on when you create a strategy in a silo, you'll be confronted from many sides that it might not be the path that your members are expecting you to take. And so from the National Association perspective, to be able to operationalize, I think these initiatives and have them fit into your strategic plan, you need to have buy-in from members. Not only buy-in from members, sometimes these initiatives are driven by your members, and that's what we've seen at CMC is we've seen the board of directors are driving these initiatives, as well as members are passing resolutions for CMC to take more action on climate. And sometimes the way that we think of the strategy internally, we're confronted and pleasantly surprised with the ways that members would prefer that we take that approach. And I think that speaks to having more engagement with members, whether that's through surveys or direct engagement, and trying to figure out what are the barriers that they're actually facing, and how would you as a convening actor help them overcome those barriers, not necessarily taking the approach that you see in other associations. Best practices are really useful, but having that direct relationship with your members, board of directors, and feeding that together creates a much more realistic plan that you can operationalize. And I think the last point that I was noting is it's really not a direct path. That climate action has so many touch points in organizations, and something we've seen in CMC is trying to prioritize the various initiatives that our members are pushing, and the board of directors are pushing, and internationally and nationally are being pushed. And so how can we have these fit together? And one of the ways we look at that is, one of our examples is we've had various funders that have provided funding for CMC to have initiatives such as the Investment Readiness Program, which is recently closed and still active, the 5030 project in partnership with the Women's Economic Council, which is for promoting more leadership and diversity and leadership for equity deserving groups in the co-op sector. Both of those projects have various touch points to climate action. One being a capacity builder, of building capacity of organizations to be able to act on these things. The other having touch points to increasing diversity and representation within the cooperative sector to act on climate action. And so with limited resources, we really try to bridge together what are we working on and how does it relate to climate action, and how can we bring climate action in a more meaningful way, while we do have our own capacity that we can work off of. And when there is funding offered, sometimes those what's going on in the ecosystem and what the ecosystem is willing to fund sometimes turn into your priorities. And are there ways that you can find creative integration methods into your existing strategic plans? So again, not to repeat the lessons of the first panel, but I think we really touched into what are the frameworks, but there's still some barriers we see in organizations, often to do with capacity, prioritization, and focus to operationalize those initiatives, and we want to recognize that.
Thank you, Joanna. Yeah, I'm really picking up on a theme of kind of building off what Noémie brought up as well, engaging with the various departments, divisions, members that are a part of your cooperative in some way, and ensuring that addressing the climate crisis is a common thread through a variety of conversations. And I would also add, from my perspective, working as a consultant with cities and the public, general communities, there's also an opportunity to look a little broader than one's own cooperative. And as Irfan mentioned, look at other funding sources that may be available from various levels of government to address those resources, or to look at what targets the government within the jurisdiction within which you operate as a cooperative. What are their targets? What are their actions? Is there a way that they've already kind of figured some of these things out, and you can be a part of what's already going on, rather than having to feel like you invent your own strategy or reinvent the wheel locally? So just a little more on this question in particular, I want to open up to Alison and Noémie, just with the general question of, in terms of incorporating climate action into your organization's operations, what would have been helpful to know before, or previously on this journey? If you could have taken a training program, what would have been included in that to address some of the challenges that you encountered, and to really operationalize, as we're discussing, climate action in your organization? So either Alison or Noémie.
Go ahead, Alison.
Okay, go ahead, Alison.
Thanks very much. So that, Carol, I think, so yeah, I mean, I would love for there to have been something in place. But actually, I will say we've learned a lot from others. So, looking back over the journey that we've gone on over the past few years, I would say we've learned that, and I alluded to this earlier, like the challenge is really big. And Carol, you talked at the beginning about, eating an elephant, right? It's hard to know where to start that process, and it can feel really overwhelming. So I would say we've learned that just starting somewhere is better than being freaked out by the scale and then sort of circling and not doing something because you're not really sure where you should start the process. And you could have endless conversations about where to start. What's important is to get started. I would also say we've learned that we can't let perfection be the enemy of progress. I think, and we've had to keep relearning that as we go along. Like we want to do, you want to do the big thing or the right thing, or it sometimes can feel like, oh, is there just a solution that's maybe just out of reach? And maybe if we spent a little bit more, time each time, like could we just come to it? But as I look around, in the financial sector and when it comes to climate action more broadly, like it isn't this, not that has been cracked somewhere else. And if we could just figure that out, we'd have our solution. You got to get started, and it's not going to be perfect, but you are going to learn and be able to iterate and make progress and actually get more tangible progress the more you learn and the further you go. I'd also say that as we've done this work, we found out there's a lot of groups out there who can help you make progress. So, we talked a little bit about, looking to others in your specific sector and looking at what they're doing. You'll obviously have to, as Jonah said, make sure your approach is your own, but I think you can learn a lot from what others are doing in this space, and also leveraging those powers of partnerships or cooperation within the larger sector. How can we work together to actually and drive progress? We have partnered with some other cooperative financial institutions to advocate for specific initiatives relevant to our sector in order to make progress with government, to say, actually, we as a group would like this, and help to give some assurance to government that this is something that industry is looking for. There's also other groups that can help you make progress. We've leaned a lot on the Principles for Responsible Banking and Principles for Responsible Investment, which are initiatives out of the UN Environmental Program. And then I would say we've learned that really our membership wants to see us take action as we've been doing this. Like, first of all, we know that they were a driver behind us doing this, but then as we've been taking action, we do hear a lot of feedback from our members that they're happy to see Vancity taking this approach when it comes to climate action. In terms of a training program, it would be huge, but I'd say there are some things out there. I think if I was to design something, I would say it would be a program that could help you figure out, first of all, where to focus your efforts. So looking at where you can reduce harm the most, where you can drive positive impact the most, something that would then help you figure out what your organization is going to actually do once you know what your biggest impacts are, and then something that guides you on how to actually deliver on your ambition. So there are tools out there like impact assessments. There's training with the GHG protocol. Again, you can find other similar cooperatives, and there's lots of other frameworks out there relevant to different industries that can help you take action. So while it would be a really big course, I'd say you can kind of design your own based on the resources that are out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Alison. And we'll turn it over to Noémie to talk a little bit more about how this is playing out for Solio.
Oui, en fait, nous, de notre côté, chez Solio, un des projets qu'on a mis en place là, pour évidemment prendre action pour les changements climatiques, ça a été de réaliser un bilan GES et hydrique complet pour l'ensemble des 3 divisions et des partenariats de chez Solio, donc de plus de 350 installations. Le bilan a été réalisé en 2022. C'est un bilan qui est vraiment officiel, dont les résultats ont été divulgués, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, pour l'année de référence 2019-2020, donc une année avant la pandémie, pour que les résultats reflètent en fait une situation là, qui était plus réaliste que les années de pandémie qu'on a vécues. Évidemment, puisqu'on a réalisé notre premier bilan officiel en 2022, on n'est vraiment pas un leader dans notre secteur d'activité en termes d'inventaire et de définition de cibles GES, mais nous ne sommes pas non plus les derniers, le dernier wagon du train. Donc, cet exercice qui sera récurrent, en fait, chaque année, c'est un engagement du conseil d'administration, nous a permis de nous mesurer pour ensuite nous positionner. Ça, c'est très important aussi. On s'est basé sur le standard du GHG Protocol pour être capable de réaliser l'inventaire. C'est un exercice qui a été effectué en collaboration avec une firme de consultants, mais pour les prochaines années, on a rapatrié l'expertise à l'interne dans mon équipe et c'est nous qui allons réaliser le bilan GES des 3 divisions pour les prochaines années. Les résultats ont été présentés au conseil d'administration et à la haute direction, donc ils ont pu avoir vraiment un portrait très actualisé de nos émissions GES, des principaux postes d'émissions, autant pour le scope 1, le scope 2, le scope 3. Les émissions GES qui sont en plus grande quantité, c'est évidemment dans le scope 3. Donc, il va falloir raffiner, en fait, la collecte de données pour celui-ci dans le futur. C'est un engagement qu'on a pris. Et puis, par la suite, le CA et la haute direction ont donné leur aval afin que l'organisation et ses divisions se dotent de cibles de réduction d'ici 2025. Donc, on a beaucoup de travail à faire d'ici là. On doit s'assurer de la cohérence de l'exercice. Donc, le cadrage des cibles de réduction GES est en cours pour l'ensemble du groupe. On va se définir des grandes lignes directrices pour, évidemment, se baser sur les mêmes grands standards, je pense, le SBTI, mais on verra par la suite qu'on aura terminé notre balisage. Les objectifs de ce projet sont de mettre en lumière les standards comme SBTI, les meilleures pratiques et les tendances en matière de cibles GES afin de guider la prise de décision, d'outiller nos équipes à l'interne pour le calcul de trajectoires de réduction ambitieuses et réalistes, appuyées par des projets potentiels en éco-efficacité notamment, et d'accompagner la mise en place d'un plan d'action pour travailler à réduire les GES et notre consommation d'eau, mais appuyé par une gouvernance claire qui va venir des plus hautes instances de l'organisation. Donc, comme je disais, par la suite, on est en train de développer un centre d'expertise à même Solio et on a l'intention de pouvoir faire partager et de transférer nos connaissances aux différentes coopératives de notre réseau qui pourront eux aussi se doter d'un bilan GES, ce qui va nous permettre aussi une situation gagnante-gagnante où quand leur scope 3 sera défini, ça va nous permettre aussi de raffiner le scope 3 de nos bilans respectifs afin d'intégrer des données plus précises là, pour intégrer toute la chaîne de valeur des activités et des opérations des 3 divisions. C'est un projet de grande envergure, mais qui est extrêmement mobilisant et engageant, autant pour les ressources présentes actuellement que pour aller rechercher des nouveaux talents aussi à l'extérieur. Et puis les employés à l'interne, c'est quand même une source de fierté là, de savoir que l'organisation est engagée activement on est engagé et mobilisé pour réduire nos émissions GES et consommer mieux l'eau, donc et réduire notre consommation d'eau aussi. Donc, ça crée beaucoup de valeur ajoutée à l'interne, autant dans les différents piliers de la démarche de responsabilité d'entreprise, soit environnement, social et la gouvernance.
Thank you, Noémie. So yeah, a couple of similar themes from both of you, Alison and Noémie, in terms of, starting somewhere, taking measurements, and also building that internal capacity for your organization and your members as well. If you're a federated co-op or you have other partners to work with potentially on reducing their emissions indirectly. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tom to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that cooperators has faced and what they are doing to promote climate action in the broader economy. So Tom, if you can talk about one initiative you think other co-ops can learn from, especially one that has helped you overcome any challenges along the way.
Okay, thanks, Carol. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that inspires me, because I do find I talk too much about the sorts of challenges that Alison and Noémie and Irfan described earlier. So I think the story I'd like to share brings us back to 2014, when at the time senior management and the board were increasingly thinking about how to formally integrate and embed cooperative and sustainability principles into everything that we do in the enterprise. And through the course of this reflection, it became apparent that we had a really significant lever for potential climate impact that at the time was not being fully utilized. And that was our investment portfolio. Alison was talking about financed emissions earlier on, also related to investment portfolio. Insurance companies, this was a fact that really surprised me. Insurance companies, I believe, are the second largest institutional investors in Canada after pension plans. So there's a significant amount of financial capital that can be put to good use. So we launched a strategy for impact investing in 2015, and I think it would be an understatement, frankly, to say that it's been a success. The portfolio has performed very well. We've consistently exceeded our targets on what proportion of our total investment portfolio is in impact. And we're presently sitting, I think, just shy of a quarter of our total investment portfolio that's in impact investments, with a target by 2030 to reach 60% in either impact or climate transition investments. And just today, just a little sidebar, a little moment of pride just today, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, of which we're a part, published its annual progress report. And there's a little case study on cooperators in there. Little cooperators from Little Canada on the global stage, being case studied for the proportion of our investment portfolio in climate solutions. I don't say that at all to boast. Frankly, it came as quite a surprise to us as well. But I say that rather to tee up one of the lessons, potential lessons for other co-ops that you asked me to try to elicit, Carol. And that is, if we think strategically about what resources and capabilities that we have as cooperatives that we can bring to bear for climate action, then I think we're most likely to maximize the amount of positive impact that we can create with the limited resources that we have. And so this is about choosing where to focus, choosing, knowing ourselves and what we bring, and then deciding strategically where to focus in order to have the most impact. I think the second lesson is, as cooperatives, arguably, so I'm expressing my own opinion here, I think many of us perhaps have a little bit more leeway to think longer term and to lead with our values than perhaps some other types of organizations do. And if that's true, it positions us to act as catalysts and show others what's possible. And so this is the final thread of your question, was how we're promoting climate action in the broader economy. I think I see this story that I've just shared as us doing just what I described, thinking longer term, leading with our values, and then ultimately blazing a trail for some others. And there have been others who've blazed trails as well. And Vancity, I'm looking to you, Alison. The more examples that we can have of leadership from co-ops, or frankly from any organizations, the more people that we can bring, the more organizations that we can bring on side to say, hey, look, it is possible to continue to meet your fiduciary responsibilities. It is possible to meet your financial return and risk requirements, all while generating positive externalities for society and for the climate. And the more of us that show that leadership and provide those proof points of success, I think the more likely others are to come on board and to pile on and ultimately get us to where we urgently need to get to. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to dig into any of that later if you want.
Thanks, Tom. That is a great inspiration, I think, and a good jumping off point for just opening it up among the panelists here that we have today. You know, we've heard about each other's challenges and successes. Would any of you like to ask the other panelists to elaborate further, or maybe a question has come up during our conversation today that you'd like to ask?
Hi, Carol. Maybe I'll ask a question, sure, of others on the panel. So I've worked in the broad sustainability space for quite a while. And one of the things that I've observed now having a bit more time to be involved is that as a sort of broader economy goes through ebbs and flows and we enter into more challenging times, which I think we are feeling at the moment, there can sometimes be a then sort of mirrored effect on the effort put into action around sustainability and specifically climate action, right? So the going gets tough, and sometimes the focus is lowered and moved to other areas. I will say I'm very grateful to work in an organization where I'm not seeing that, but I know more broadly that can be a challenge. And so I'd love to hear from the other co-ops how you, as you go through challenging times, either the economy's in a challenging moment, or maybe within your organization it's a challenging moment. How do you keep momentum and attention on this agenda?
I could speak just a little bit, a very brief answer. One of the things I think when an organization, for whatever reason, whether for resource or internal shifts, is prioritizing other parts of their organization, especially when they're capacity related, I would encourage folks to see it as part of their climate action journey and to write it into their climate action journey and to identify that as a barrier within your organization that's preventing you to act on that. And when it arises, it ebbs and flows. Sometimes your momentum has to shift, that in order to act on climate action, you need to maintain very strong governance in cooperatives is very important and looks a little different than other organizations, takes a lot of management. So when an organization looks inward and says, okay, we need to do some internal capacity building to ensure that we're communicating very clearly with our members and our board and our management, and that those connections are well suited, and we need our operations to be strong, and we need our team to ebb and flow together, and our board to ebb and flow together, or have camaraderie and shared goals and purpose. I see that as all being crucial to the climate action plan in general. And if sort of written into the strategy that part of climate action is having the internal capacity to do so, it also allows organizations to identify when those gaps start occurring a little quicker, to say if one of our main strategic priorities is climate action, sustainability, however they frame that portfolio in their organization, it puts an onus on the organization to sometimes prioritize governance and operations. And I would point to the example of CMC looking at the investment readiness program as having connections to supporting organizations to be able to take action on these big issues that we see in our communities, that with low capacity organizations do struggle to take action on justice, climate action, youth initiatives, and these sorts of things. And so especially for when we're looking at all sizes of organizations, small, medium, and large, I really think you can write in those journeys right into the action plan, that part of approaching climate action can be bolstering your internal resources. So not to circle around, I'll end my comment there, but I think it's a really realistic issue that you bring up, and I think when it's written into, it's going to be part of the journey that your resources might ebb and flow. It allows the organization to identify the gaps and the issues even earlier, before they maybe start making a dent in the progress. And so that's how I think we've had to approach it as well, of just building up capacity to act on all of the strategies that we want to act on, and that's very much part of the journey to make it sustainable, and also to avoid single points of failure within an organization, so that it can continue after maybe the dedicated staff is gone.
I would add to that as well that there's, what you're bringing up, Alison, it's a really good point. There are high and low points economically in the broader economy in which we're all operating. And, sometimes that necessitates cutting back in certain areas. I think what Joanna has outlined is helpful in terms of building resilience to addressing these ideas within your organization as much as possible. There's also following the money, thinking about if we're trying to cut back in certain areas in terms of spending. Sometimes the climate, the choice for the climate is also one that can save you money, even in the short term, even with the initial purchase, not just in the ongoing purchase. So keeping that lens front and center can be a way of kind of keeping those things going, but using a different framing around them. It's like, oh, this is cost saving as much as it is climate action sometimes. I'd like to open it to Irfan and Noémie if you have any response that you'd like to share.
Just a couple of comments on my end, I guess, and just I guess slightly reiterate what was just said. I think it needs to be, like, from a climate perspective, that needs to be integrated into the organization's main goals, and I think that is a must. If you see in the commercial real estate sector, for instance, everyone is starting to put together ESG reports and whatnot, and I think it's becoming the norm to investors when looking at commercial real estate. So I think, slowly but surely, it needs to happen in our sector as well. And I think it will eventually when the time is ready. And like you mentioned as well, from a financial perspective, I think we're getting to the point where, climate change is one thing, but I think when you're thinking about finances now, the way the government at all levels is moving is in a direction where being climate conscious is the financial opportunity for you as well now. So it's the right thing to do from a financial perspective, or at least it's getting there, and there's more and more programs available to help out in that perspective.
OK, thanks, Ifram. Nous, de notre côté, là, chez Solio Groupe Coopératif, évidemment, le fait d'opérer dans une économie de marché capitaliste, évidemment, ça nous a affecté au cours des 3 dernières années, comme la plupart de vos entreprises et de vos organismes. Ça a été surtout un enjeu de disponibilité des ressources financières là, qui a représenté un frein à la mise de l'avant des initiatives pour lutter contre les changements climatiques. Vous le savez tous, plusieurs grands événements mondiaux ont impacté financièrement les organisations, dont la nôtre, au niveau de l'approvisionnement notamment. Donc, pensant à la COVID-19 qui a entraîné une volatilité des prix des commodités. Chez Solio Agriculture, l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie a un impact immédiat sur le prix des produits agricoles de base au cours des dernières semaines, des derniers mois, je voudrais dire. Le résultat, c'est que le prix des fertilisants était en forte hausse, là, de 2 à 3 fois plus cher la tonne. La Russie est un grand exportateur de ses 3 principaux engrais, l'azote, le phosphate et la potasse. Donc ça nous a affecté énormément. Les conflits aussi géopolitiques entre la Chine et le Canada ont engendré des enjeux d'exportation des viandes de porc en Asie. Il y a aussi la pénurie de la main-d'œuvre agricole. Donc, en fonction de toute cette espèce de conjoncture économique-là, ça crée un cocktail là, très peu favorable pour la disponibilité des ressources financières. Donc, plusieurs projets d'investissement en CAPEX qui avaient été prévus au cours des 2 dernières années pour améliorer la performance énergétique de nos installations, par exemple, ont été reportés à plus tard, puis ils n'ont pas été annulés, mais reportés à plus tard afin de pouvoir se concentrer nos efforts pour gérer des urgences. Donc, nous, ça a vraiment été la disponibilité des ressources financières là, qui a été vraiment difficile. Comme j'imagine d'autres organisations coopératives aussi, ou même des entreprises cotées en bourse.
Thank you, Noémie. Any further thoughts from our panel on this excellent question before we open it up to some audience questions? All right, well, let's turn to the audience Q&A. So I see we have one question here, and if you have more questions, audience members, please put them in the Q&A so we can see them. So our first question is about offsetting emissions. within the climate movement, there's lots of critique for climate offsetting. So basically, paying for other projects that remove emissions or that reduce emissions in some other way. There's critique about this for multiple reasons. There's this comment says there's evidence of it being connected to human rights violations. For example, pushing Indigenous people off their land to plant trees. It's also often viewed as an easy way out. And a recent study showed that 80% of them achieve simply nothing. So this is, I think, a question for Alison, but I'll open up to everyone. How does Vancity work to validate offsetting if they're using offsetting initiatives? And is there any plan in terms of getting away from offsetting strategies?
Thanks for that, Carol. I am happy to start there and then open it up to others. So a great question, and this comes up a lot. So first, I think what I want to say is net zero and carbon neutral or climate are two separate things. We cannot use offsets to get ourselves to net zero. The entire point of a strategy in that space, and Vancity does have a net zero strategy, is all about reductions first and foremost. And only when you have reached what would be net zero, so there are no further emissions reductions you can look to drive at that moment, then you are looking to offset the remainder of those emissions to bring yourself to zero. So it's reductions first and foremost. So you should not be relying on offsets in order to be able to get yourself there. Secondly is if you, as we move towards net zero, we are going to need to get to that net zero point to offset those remaining emissions, high quality, effective offsets that organizations, individuals, governments, et cetera, are able to access. Your question raises that really important point that at the moment, the market is not there. There are real challenges in that market in terms of the offsets that are available. There is, however, good guidance out there in terms of what you should look for if you are looking to support an offset project, and considerations that you should look to when you're doing that. And Vancity's approach when we are offsetting, and we are offsetting a portion of our operational emissions and have been doing for some time, is we have a pretty clear criteria in terms of what we look for in the projects that we invest in. And this is something that we will also need to evolve and look to over the long term as we move closer to net zero. So specifically, we look to invest in projects that are additional, that have been validated, that are verified that the emissions reductions occurred, that demonstrate unique ownership of those offset credits. And then we have some specific criteria around them being based in Canada, British Columbia, et cetera, is a preference of ours. Not having those negative environmental or social impacts mentioned in the question. And if you want to really dive in on Vancity's approach, we've got it fully detailed on our website. But just to say that the focus should be on reductions. We will need a strong offset market, and so there is the need to work on that problem that you raise right now, and that if you are looking for offsets, make sure that you're following some of the guidance that's out there. Oxford offsetting principles is a great one.
Thanks, Alison. Other thoughts on offsets or any other co-ops on the call using offsets, or how is that being considered in your strategies?
I'm happy to jump in there, and I'll do so quickly just so I can say everything Alison just said. Those would have been exactly the key messages I would have delivered, and I'm seeing others nod as well. We do use offsets for our operational emissions, put through a number of very clear criteria like Alison enumerated. Permanence is another of those criteria that comes to mind. Leakage is another. The piece that I would add is it relates to the comment that was in the chat. Yeah, it's still in the chat, which is it is absolutely critical, emphatic agreement here on have on the need to have shorter term targets and then concrete plans in addition to the long-term ultimate goals we're striving towards. And just to give a specific example that makes the point Alison was making on the need to focus on actual emissions reductions. So we've got an interim 2030 target, and it applies to our gross emissions before offsets. So this is en route to our net zero by 2040 target, and this directs us to drive down emissions without using offsets. So we will get down to 45% from below our baseline by 2030, and annually that is monitored. And so we're looking at this on a year-to-year basis, in fact, on a semi-annual basis in some parts of the organization. And really critical that be gross emissions, not emissions with including offsets, and any offsets that, to reiterate Alison's point, any offsets that are considered must be of the highest quality, not just picking the cheapest offset off the shelf. Otherwise, because you can't stand behind it. And there are some serious concerns that have been well documented with many offsets out there on the market.
Thank you, Tom, for that segue. So just to be clear about this second question that's being asked, there's a concern about 2040 and 2050 being targets that are easy to, they're out in the future. It's easy to think of them as being later on, and maybe that's too late. So the question is around, are there opportunities to advocate to create 2030 targets and even create interim 2, 3, 5-year targets? So I have a question for the panelists. If you can raise your hand, does your organization have a 2050 GHG reduction target currently? Yes, okay. I was like, I think a few of you do, a 2050 target. And what about a 2030 target? And Tom, were you saying you have a 2040 one? Or did I misunderstand?
2050 for investment portfolio, 2040 for operations, and an interim, so not net zero, but an interim target to 2030.
An interim target, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Noémie and Erfan, that's not something currently in place, is that correct?
De notre côté, non, ce n'est pas encore en place, mais comme je vous le disais, on a un projet pour cadrer les grandes lignes directrices pour être en mesure de se définir une cible d'ici 2025. Donc, j'ose espérer que la cible sera une cible SBTI net zéro en 2050. Mais je pense qu'on va devoir de toute façon établir des cibles intérimaires 2030, 2040, 2050. Mais ne répétez pas ce que je viens de dire parce que ça, c'est mon opinion à moi, mais je pense que c'est vers là qu'on va aller.
On my end, unfortunately, I won't be able to comment on this as I'm not really too involved on that side of the business. I do know that we are tenants in a couple of offices and whatnot, but I know that different cities and municipalities that our offices are located in have targets, and I'm sure that our organization would follow those. For instance, City of Toronto, I think they want to go net zero by 2040, if I'm not mistaken. So, as a tenant, I don't know how that's going to affect a tenant, but I know at the building level, they're going to have to start looking at the HVAC there and whatnot to reduce the emissions.
Thanks. That's a great point, both in terms of, yes, where you are operating, what the targets and policies of those cities and provinces may be, may in some effect set a maximum outside target for a lot of your operations. Maybe that some cooperatives want to get ahead of those targets as well. And we have a message in the chat around just the, the difficulty of, or the challenges, let's say, of particular places, in this case around the Arctic. I'm not sure if anyone has operations there or has dealt with offsets in terms of addressing emissions in the Arctic. You could speak to that. We have just maybe time for one more question from the audience. Or anyone else on the panel to respond to anything brought up today.
I'll just quickly on that point on the question previously around the interim targets. So similar to Tom at Vancity, we've got a net zero by 2040 goal for our lending and 2050 for investments, but have set those interim targets in between. So we have a target for 2025 and a number of sort of checkpoints along the way on our net zero journeys with respect to both of those different portfolios. And that brings the action forward, right, to right now. So it's not like at 2035 like we panic and are like, oh, okay, how's this been going and what are we doing? I would say one of the challenges in that process is our data is not good. So we're not able to measure actual emissions reductions at the moment, in particular for our lending. And so we could achieve the targets and actually maybe not even be able to measure that we have. It may look like we haven't, or we may not, and like it's hard to know. But again, it's about galvanizing action between that, and then having those targets actually also pushes you to figure out and work through those data challenges really front and center for you. So I would say, don't be afraid of targets where you really are having some of that struggle in terms of like, can I actually measure this? I mean, do the best you can, but it doesn't have to be perfect, as I touched on earlier.
Thanks, Alison. And that reminded me, I wanted to clarify SBTI, which I think Noémie and a few others have mentioned. So the Science-Based Target Initiative, that is developing your organization, and this applies to governments as well, developing targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement, what I mentioned at the top of the call, but also taking into consideration, in terms of how many more tons of CO2 can be emitted to stay within that threshold, and also what are the roles of organizations and governments in the global north or in the developed world, or however you want to frame it. Those of us who have more resources and who have been emitting longer compared to global south, developing countries, et cetera. So taking that kind of global equity approach in terms of addressing emissions can help set your targets as well. And keeping in mind that the target is one thing, but the path to getting there and how much you're able to reduce emissions between now and then, essentially your curve on your graph of your emissions between now and say 2030, that's the important part, right? The atmosphere doesn't care about if you reach the target or not. The atmosphere is affected by every ton matters. So I think we need to wrap it up there. It's been a really insightful discussion today. It's just so interesting hearing from so many different sectors. And I want to give a very small plug for my consultancy, SSG. We do work with organizations on things like setting targets and figuring out plans to take climate action. If any of this is interesting to you all, we'd love to chat more. I'm sure we can distribute our contact info, or you can visit our website. But please give up a round of applause for our panelists. So great to hear from you all. And I will pass it back to Véronique. Thank you.
So thank you all for attending this panel. I'm so glad that you were all here today with us to exchange ideas and hear what our very knowledgeable panelists had to say. So thank you so much to each and every one of the panelists, and thank you so much to Carol for moderating that panel. We really appreciate your expertise and knowledge through that whole meeting. So thank you all, and we are so glad to have you all here today. So have a nice one. Bye bye.